very recently saw some footage of Billy Graham's revival in Madison Square Garden. It was produced around the anniversary, one of the anniversaries of this revival in Madison Square Garden. And it was really interesting to watch for a number of reasons. First, it was really fantastic to see a young Billy Graham, sort of alive and vital and powerful and dynamic and just full of this kind of vim and vigor and energy. But it was also really interesting to hear some of the original commentary around that event. It sounded a lot like listening to the radio for a play-by-play for a baseball game. And now, Pastor Graham comes into the building. He is walking toward the pulpit. I think he's about to speak. You know, it had that kind of a flavor to it. And the commentators were dissecting every bit of the event, telling the audience what it meant. And I watched this whole production, and even some of the commentary, the modern commentary, looking back on the event, waiting for someone to ask the question, why? You know, how was it that thousands of people in New York City, and let's face it, New York City can be, I've lived there, and I sort of consider myself an honorary New Yorker. New York City can be a very detached sort of a place. It takes something beyond the norm to happen for people to pay very much attention at all. New Yorkers sort of pride themselves on being able to walk by something that would just stop any other city in its tracks. They pride themselves on sort of keeping ahead. So what was it about this young preacher from a small town in North Carolina that galvanized thousands of people to come out of their apartments and out of their homes, to leave their workplaces and spend an evening listening to him talk about his understanding, and more than just understanding, but his experience of the gospel in his own life? No one ever asked the question in this production, so no answer was ever given. But I assume people arrived at Madison Square Garden ready to hear something, ready to receive something that they felt like they didn't already have, ready to listen to the authentic words of a preacher who believes what he has to say and lives a life of integrity marked by his words. This past week, I explored the gospel lesson that we just read this morning about the baptism of Jesus with a small group of friends. And we picked the thing apart, as this group always does. We picked at the little pieces of the story. The relationship of Jesus and John the Baptist. We dissected it. We considered all elements of it, how they were related, what they knew, how they related as adults, what it all must have been about. We picked at Jesus' self-awareness. Did Jesus know he was the Messiah? When did Jesus know that he was the Messiah? How did it change the way Jesus' life lived, knowing he was the Messiah? Talked about baptism and its Jewish roots. All salient and central features of the gospel text that we just heard. But finally, one of my friends asked, what were they doing out there in the wilderness? Why did they leave Jerusalem? Why did they leave the temple and the Temple Mount? Why did they leave establishment Judaism and go out there to hear what this upstart Baptist, weird-wearing, strange-acting cat had to say? Isn't that what it's really all about? What is it that moved them out there, and what is it that moves us here? I think they're searching for something in the first century. I think they've heard about John the Baptist. I think they've heard his message of a baptism for repentance, which is kind of code for changing one's life, orienting oneself in God's direction, and taking on a new way of being in the world. I think they've heard all that, and they've recognized that they're not quite getting that. So they go out there in spades, large crowds, looking for the more that John the Baptist is talking about. I don't think that there's anything wrong with establishment-oriented Judaism at all. I don't think this is about being critical of Judaism. I think this is about recognizing that God can do something beyond the establishment and going out there to find out what that is and what it might mean for life. We've all heard Jesus' critique of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the warring parties within Judaism. And maybe the people that go out to the wilderness are just tired of hearing all of that, all of the conflict, all of the squawking. And maybe they're looking for something central, something core. Love of God, love of neighbor, the kind of circumcision of the heart that the prophets of old wrote about in their texts. Maybe they go out there to the wilderness, to the river Jordan, because they're ready to make the change and embrace what they perceive to be the more that God offers. And they get more, don't they? They go out and they're privy to this experience of the revelation and affirmation of Jesus' identity. And it's because they had this instinct that God is doing something outside and beyond, because they have this instinct and move in that direction and go out there, they experience it. They see that more is possible, and it's being made available by God through a kind of personal presence. Jesus' baptism is God's more, and it's the starting line for those ready to get on living and experiencing God's more in this way. I recently had a conversation with a young person seeking baptism, and I followed through with my usual routine. When someone is of an age where discussion is possible, I gave him a book. And I said, go have a look at this, give it a once-over, and then come back and let's talk about it. Let's see if you have any questions and what comes up for you. So my young friend takes the book and he reads it, and I ask him a couple of questions upon his return, and it's very clear that we read it. And I asked, well, then why do you desire to be baptized? And my friend said, I feel like I'm being called into something bigger. I feel like I'm being called to something more. Now, as we think about this, Is that all of it? Well, no, because it's infinitely complex and there's so much. We could talk about baptism as a sacrament. We could talk about, again, the peculiarities of Jesus' baptism. We could wrestle with Byzantine baptismal practices in the medieval period. And it could be all marvelous. But being part of something bigger, something more, isn't that what the call of this is about? Isn't that what the life of faith is about? It's that we're not just individuals locked into our shells. We're called to a life of transcendence that's bigger than we are, where we transcend our individual boundaries, where we transcend our community boundaries, where we embrace a world and seek to change it in the name of love and life and abundance and richness. And we recognize that God is the only place where that is available. My friend's remarks are full of the instinct that God's invitation to be part of something bigger is real. And it's a genuine offer made to us once in baptism, but forever as we seek to live a journey of faith. We are charged as this community to be God's more in the world. We're called together to desire more for ourselves and for the world. Not only our individual righteousness, but the righteousness of the entire cosmos and every person that we encounter. And the good news is that the God of more wants to do the craziest thing ever. The God of more just wants to give it to us. Just wants to unleash it upon us and send us in the world to unleash that love upon the world. To give us a life more abundant, more generous, and more complete. And our response, friends, is so simple. So we're going to slow it down. I want you to hang on to this. Hang on to this. If you've heard nothing else, particularly the Byzantine baptismal bit, push that all aside. Here is the thing. To accept God's offer, all we have to do is turn our backs on less. We just have to say that less isn't enough. We just have to say that scarcity will not abide. We just embrace God's gift of abundant life with our open, empty hands, and we allow God to fill them. And God's promise is that God will. Run from scarcity like it's the plague, because it is a plague, and it will kill us if we let it. Lay claim to the abundant life that God offers us now and forever.